The static crackled through command speakers at 3:47 hours, then died into a silence that made Colonel Marcus Webb's coffee taste like ash. For the past 6 hours, they'd been tracking SEAL Team Bravo's infiltration of a Taliban stronghold in the Kunar province, but now their comms had gone dark. Complete radio silence from 12 of America's elite warriors dropped into terrain so hostile that even the mountains seemed to lean inward like predators. "Sir, we've lost all contact with Bravo Team." Lieutenant Morrison's voice carried the tremor of someone who'd never delivered news this catastrophic. His hands moved frantically across the communication console, cycling through frequencies that returned nothing but the white noise of empty air. Webb set down his mug with deliberate calm, though his pulse hammered against his collar. In 32 years of military service, he'd learned that panic was a luxury commanders couldn't afford. "How long since last contact?" 47 minutes, sir. Last transmission was Bravo 6 confirming visual on the target compound. The tactical display painted a grim picture. 12 green dots had vanished from the digital map, swallowed by the jagged peaks of Afghanistan's most unforgiving territory. Webb studied the topographical data, noting the spider web of caves and ridgelines that could hide an army or swallow one without a trace. Then the impossible happened. A voice materialized through the speakers, crystal clear despite originating from coordinates that showed nothing but empty sky. It was calm, professional, tinged with an accent that spoke of southern summers and front porch conversations. But what made every person in the command center freeze wasn't the clarity or the drawl. It was that the voice belonged to Captain Delaney Ghost Rourke, a pilot who'd been grounded for the past 3 months. "This is Ghost Actual to any station. I have eyes on Bravo Team's last known position. 12 souls in immediate danger, requesting permission to assist." Webb's blood turned to ice water. Ghost was supposed to be stateside, fighting a bureaucratic war over an incident that had stripped her of flight status. More troubling still, there were no aircraft showing on radar anywhere near those coordinates. The voice seemed to emanate from thin air itself, as if the mountains had learned to speak. Morrison's hands trembled over his console. "Sir, that transmission. It's coming through a classified frequency that was decommissioned 2 years ago, and according to our logs, Captain Rourke is—" He swallowed hard. "She's not even in country, sir." Webb stared at the empty tactical display where the voice had originated, wondering if he was witnessing a miracle or descending into madness. Either way, 12 Navy SEALs were counting on answers he didn't have. The radio frequency that technically didn't exist buzzed again with Ghost's voice, and this time, she wasn't asking for permission. 3 months earlier, Captain Delaney Rourke had been the kind of pilot other aviators whispered about in ready rooms, not because she was reckless or flashy, but because she possessed an almost supernatural ability to make aircraft perform beyond their design specifications. Her call sign, Ghost, hadn't come from any dramatic aerial maneuver. It came from her habit of appearing exactly where she was needed, often before anyone realized they needed her there. The AH-64 Apache helicopter responded to her touch like a living thing, its twin turboshaft engines humming in harmony with her breathing. She'd logged over 2,000 combat hours across 3 deployments, each mission adding another layer to the legend that followed her through the ranks. Fellow pilots spoke of the way she could thread an Apache through mountain passes that existed only on classified maps, delivering ordnance with surgical precision, while enemy fire lit up the sky around her. But legends, as Delaney had learned, were fragile things. The incident that had grounded her replayed in her mind during the sleepless nights that followed. Operation Crosswind had been routine until it wasn't. A platoon of Rangers pinned down by concentrated Taliban fire in a valley that maps labeled as strategically insignificant. Command had deemed the rescue too risky, the casualties acceptable within mission parameters. Delaney had disagreed, vehemently. She'd ignored direct orders, diving her Apache into a killing field that should have claimed both her and her weapons officer. The rocket-propelled grenades had come so close that she could smell the cordite through her helmet's air filtration system. But 37 American soldiers had walked away from that valley, and that was the only number that mattered to her. The Military Review Board had seen things differently. They'd stripped her of flight status, citing insubordination and reckless endangerment of military assets. The bureaucrats in their air-conditioned offices had never felt the weight of a trigger under their finger or looked into the eyes of soldiers who'd given up hope. Now, as she moved through the abandoned hangar where her Apache sat under a canvas shroud, Delaney felt the familiar ache of separation. The aircraft seemed smaller somehow, diminished by forced retirement. She ran her hand along the armored fuselage, feeling the patches where enemy bullets had been stopped by layers of composite armor and determination. The classified radio she'd forgotten to return crackled to life in her jacket pocket, carrying voices from a war that continued without her. SEAL Team Bravo's call sign emerged through the static, followed by coordinates that made her blood run cold. She knew that terrain had pulled Marines from similar death traps when other pilots claimed it couldn't be done. Delaney looked at her grounded Apache, then at the radio transmitting desperate voices from mountains that ate aircraft and spit out wreckage. The choice should have been impossible. She was grounded, technically absent without leave, and facing court-martial if she so much as touched military equipment. Instead, she pulled away the canvas shroud and began her pre-flight inspection. The turboshaft engines of the AH-64 Apache spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder, sending vibrations through the concrete floor of the abandoned hangar. Delaney's hands moved through the startup sequence with the muscle memory of a concert pianist, each switch and gauge falling under her experienced touch. The aircraft's systems came alive around her, displays painting the cockpit in amber and green light that felt more like home than anywhere on the ground ever had. She'd modified the Apache over her 3 deployments, small improvements that existed in bureaucratic gray areas. The navigation system had been upgraded with terrain-following radar that could map mountain passes in real time. The communications array included frequencies that officially didn't exist, channels used by special operations teams who needed to talk without the whole world listening. Most importantly, she'd installed auxiliary fuel tanks that extended the helicopter's range far beyond manufacturer specifications. Goes to any station. This is an unauthorized flight requesting immediate clearance for emergency rescue operation. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd made peace with potentially career-ending decisions. The radio silence that followed didn't surprise her. Officially, she didn't exist. The Apache lifted off into a night sky that stretched endlessly above the Afghan landscape. Below, the terrain shifted from relatively flat desert to the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains, each ridge and valley holding secrets that had swallowed armies throughout history. The helicopter's forward-looking infrared radar painted the world in ghostly thermal images, revealing the heat signatures of wildlife and the occasional Taliban patrol. Navigation to SEAL Team Bravo's last known position required flying through airspace that military planners had declared off-limits to rotary-wing aircraft. The mountain passes were too narrow, the winds too unpredictable, the enemy presence too concentrated. But Delaney had spent years studying these mountains, memorizing every peak and valley through satellite imagery and pilot reports. She knew routes that existed only in the minds of aviators crazy enough to attempt them. The first indication of trouble came as radar contact with something that shouldn't have been there. A surface-to-air missile battery, recently moved into position, painted her Apache with targeting radar. The threat warning system screamed through her headphones, but Delaney was already banking hard left, dropping the helicopter into a canyon so narrow that her rotor tips nearly kissed stone walls. She'd found the trap that had claimed SEAL Team Bravo's communications. The Taliban had moved advanced weaponry into positions that would force any rescue attempt through a carefully orchestrated kill zone. They'd studied American tactics, learned to anticipate rescue operations, and prepared accordingly. But they hadn't planned for a ghost. Delaney brought the Apache to a hover behind a rock formation that concealed her heat signature, then switched to passive sensors that wouldn't alert enemy radar operators. Through her night vision, she could see the stronghold where SEAL Team Bravo had disappeared, a complex of caves and reinforced positions that bristled with weapons emplacements. The classified radio frequency crackled to life, carrying whispered voices that spoke of wounded Americans and rapidly diminishing ammunition. SEAL Team Bravo was alive, but barely, and time was running out. The voice that emerged from SEAL Team Bravo's position carried the controlled desperation of professionals acknowledging their own mortality. Chief Petty Officer Jackson Rodriguez had been leading special operations teams for 14 years, and he'd never found himself in a situation this comprehensively fucked. His team was pinned down in a cave complex that had turned from an objective into a tomb, with Taliban fighters closing in from 3 directions. "Ghost Actual, this is Bravo 6. Rodriguez's whisper barely registered above the static. "We've got 4 wounded, ammunition running low, and approximately 40 hostiles between us and any extraction point. They've got this place wired tighter than Fort Knox." Through her Apache's advanced optics, Delaney could see the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. The SEAL team occupied a cave roughly 30 meters up a sheer cliff face, accessible only by rope or helicopter. The Taliban had positioned machine gun nests to cover every possible approach, creating overlapping fields of fire that would shred any conventional rescue attempt. But Delaney had never been accused of being conventional. "Bravo 6, Ghost Actual. I count 43 hostiles in 7 distinct positions. Be advised, I'm going to make some noise to get their attention. When the fireworks start, you'll have maybe 90 seconds to get your wounded to the cave mouth." Rodriguez processed this information with the kind of tactical thinking that kept Navy SEALs alive in impossible situations. "Ghost, negative on that approach. Your single aircraft against that much concentrated fire is suicide. We can hold position until dawn, maybe catch them during shift change." "Negative Bravo 6. Your wounded won't last until dawn and you know it." The silence that followed carried the weight of men calculating the odds of survival against the certainty of death. Rodriguez keyed his radio one more time, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "Roger that, Ghost. We'll be ready." Delaney closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, feeling the Apache's controls under her hands and the weight of 12 lives hanging in the balance. When she opened them again, she was no longer thinking like a grounded pilot facing court-martial. She was thinking like Ghost, the aviator who'd earned her call sign by appearing exactly where angels feared to tread. The Apache rose from behind its concealment like something born from the mountain itself. Delaney kept the aircraft in the radar shadow of the ridgeline, using terrain masking to approach the Taliban positions from an unexpected angle. The enemy fighters had positioned their weapons to defend against approach from the valley floor, not from above. She opened fire without warning, the Apache's 30 chain gun sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds into the first machine gun nest. The weapon emplacement simply ceased to exist, reduced to scattered metal and silence. Before the other Taliban positions could react, she was already moving, the helicopter dancing between rock formations with a grace that defied physics. The enemy return fire came in waves, tracer rounds painting golden arcs across the night sky. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded against the cliff face where the Apache had been milliseconds before. But Delaney was no longer there, having slipped the helicopter into another impossible position that put solid rock between her aircraft and incoming ordnance. The 90 seconds she'd promised SEAL Team Bravo stretched into an eternity of controlled violence. each moment choreographed with the precision of someone who'd learned to dance with death and make it look effortless. The Apache's heads-up display painted the tactical situation in stark digital clarity, but Delaney relied more on instinct than instruments as she wove between incoming fire. 3 decades of flying had taught her to feel threats before her equipment could identify them, and right now every nerve ending screamed warnings about the surface-to-air missile battery that hadn't revealed itself yet. She found it by following the pattern of enemy fire. The Taliban positions were coordinated. Someone with military training was directing their response. When she eliminated the first heavy weapons position, the others adjusted their fire patterns to compensate. When she destroyed a mortar team, the remaining fighters repositioned to maintain overlapping coverage. This wasn't random resistance. This was professional soldiering. The missile battery finally revealed itself when she pressed her attack too aggressively, painting her Apache with targeting radar from a position that had been invisible to her sensors. The shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile streaked toward her aircraft trailing white smoke and certain death, but Delaney was already moving. She dropped the helicopter into a valley so narrow that her rotors generated their own weather system, creating downdrafts that slammed against the canyon walls. The missile, unable to follow such an aggressive flight path, impacted against granite and detonated in a fireball that lit up the night sky like a second sun. The explosion's pressure wave actually helped push the Apache through the canyon, adding velocity to an escape that shouldn't have been possible. Bravo 6 Ghost Actual. I've got your 6 o'clock clear for approximately 30 seconds. Move your wounded now. Rodriguez didn't waste time with acknowledgments. Through her optics, Delaney watched 12 figures emerge from the cave complex like shadows given substance. 4 were being carried by their teammates, moving with the kind of desperate efficiency that marked elite soldiers operating at the edge of their capabilities. The SEAL team had perhaps 25 meters of open ground to cover before reaching a landing zone that Delaney was still creating through concentrated firepower. The Taliban response was immediate and devastating. Automatic weapons fire swept the cliff face where the SEALs were exposed, forcing them to take cover behind rock formations that provided concealment but not protection. One of the wounded SEALs cried out as a bullet found exposed flesh, his voice carrying clearly through the mountain air. Delaney's response was surgical in its precision. The Apache's Hellfire missiles had been designed to destroy armored vehicles, but in her hands, they became precision tools for removing specific threats. The first missile eliminated a heavy machine gun position that had been suppressing SEAL movement. The second destroyed a mortar team that had been walking rounds toward the exposed Americans. But missiles were finite resources, and she was rapidly depleting her available ordnance. Ghost, this is Bravo 6. We've got wounded critical and need immediate extraction. Can you provide landing zone security? Delaney studied the terrain through her aircraft's sensors, calculating approach angles and defensive positions with the kind of three-dimensional thinking that separated good pilots from legendary ones. The proposed landing zone was a knife edge of stone barely wide enough for her Apache skids, surrounded by positions that could fill the air with bullets from multiple directions. Bravo 6, I can give you one approach window. After that, we're all going home together or not at all. She brought the Apache into a hover that defied every regulation in the tactical manual, positioning the aircraft so that its armored belly shielded the SEAL team from the heaviest concentration of enemy fire. The helicopter's turboshaft engines screamed in protest as she held position against mountain winds that tried to slam the aircraft into the cliff face. The SEALs moved with professional efficiency, loading their wounded into the Apache's passenger compartment with movements that spoke of endless repetition during training exercises that had never seemed this desperate. The weight of 12 Navy SEALs and their equipment pushed the Apache beyond its normal operational parameters, but Delaney had been flying overloaded aircraft for so long that she automatically compensated for the change in performance characteristics. The helicopter's engine strained against the additional mass, creating vibrations that traveled through the airframe like a warning of mechanical limits being exceeded. "Ghost, this is Bravo 7. The voice belonged to Hospital Corpsman Second Class Maria Santos, the team's medic. "I've got one urgent surgical, two priority medevac, and one walking wounded. We need a trauma surgeon within the next 20 minutes or we're going to lose Petty Officer Williams." Delaney's mind immediately began calculating distances to forward operating bases with surgical facilities. The nearest American medical facility was 47 minutes away at the Apache's current performance level, but there were alternative options that existed in the gray areas between official policy and practical necessity. "Bravo 7, there's a Pakistani military hospital 12 minutes south of our current position. They've got trauma surgery capability and a history of treating American casualties without asking too many questions." Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of a man making decisions that would either save lives or create international incidents. "Ghost, that's not exactly authorized medical treatment. Neither is flying a grounded aircraft into enemy territory to extract a SEAL team that officially doesn't exist," Delaney replied as she banked the overloaded Apache toward the Pakistani border. "Sometimes we improvise." The flight to the Pakistani facility required crossing terrain that had been disputed by various armies for centuries. Below them, the landscape shifted from the jagged peaks of Afghanistan to the slightly more forgiving hills that marked the border region. Delaney kept the Apache at low altitude, using terrain masking to avoid both radar detection and the various surface-to-air missile batteries that both sides had scattered throughout the region. Behind her, Corpsman Santos worked with professional efficiency to stabilize the wounded SEALs. The sound of medical equipment and whispered instructions created a counterpoint to the helicopter's turbine noise, a reminder that the mission wasn't complete until everyone reached definitive medical care. "Ghost, this is Williams." The voice was weak but determined, carrying the stubborn refusal to die that characterized special operations personnel. "I want you to know, we heard the stories about you, about why you got grounded, those rangers you pulled out of that valley. One of them was my cousin." Delaney felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. The bureaucrats who'd stripped her of flight status had focused on regulations and risk assessments, but they'd never understood the weight of lives saved or the mathematics of moral obligation. Every pilot calculated risk differently, and some calculations went beyond official doctrine. "Williams, you just focus on staying conscious until we get you to a surgeon. Save the speeches for your cousin." The Pakistani military hospital appeared through the Apache's forward-looking infrared system, a collection of concrete buildings surrounded by security walls that had been designed to withstand the periodic artillery exchanges that marked border tensions. Delaney brought the helicopter into a landing approach that violated Pakistani airspace, international law, and probably several treaties, but would put wounded Americans in front of trauma surgeons who wouldn't ask questions until after the bleeding had stopped. The landing zone was a helicopter pad marked with Pakistani military insignia, currently occupied by a medical team that had obviously been alerted to expect incoming casualties. Delaney touched down with the kind of precision that came from thousands of hours of practice, keeping the engine spooled up for immediate departure if the political situation deteriorated rapidly. "Bravo 6, this is where we part company. Get your wounded to those surgeons and figure out your own way home." Rodriguez appeared beside her cockpit window, his face carrying gratitude mixed with concern. "Ghost, what's your plan for getting out of here? Pakistani air defense is going to notice an unauthorized American military helicopter pretty quickly." Delaney smiled for the first time in 3 months. "Chief, I'm a ghost. We're good at disappearing." The Pakistani trauma surgeons worked with the kind of professional competence that transcended national boundaries. focusing on saving lives rather than examining the political complexities of how American Special Operations personnel had arrived at their facility. Within minutes of touchdown, the wounded SEALs were being wheeled into operating rooms, while Rodriguez coordinated with his chain of command through encrypted communications that would eventually untangle the diplomatic mess. Delaney used the brief respite to conduct a thorough inspection of her Apache, checking for battle damage that might affect the return flight. 3 bullet holes had penetrated the aircraft's armor plating without reaching critical systems, and one of the landing skids showed scrape marks from the extraction under fire. But the helicopter remained airworthy, which was all that mattered for the immediate future. Her unauthorized presence at a Pakistani military facility created complications that would ripple through intelligence channels for weeks, but those were problems for people who wore suits instead of flight suits. Right now, she needed to disappear before Pakistani air defense systems locked onto her aircraft and demanded explanations she couldn't provide. The return flight to Afghanistan required a different route, one that avoided the radar installations and border checkpoints that would be expecting unauthorized American aircraft. Delaney chose a path that followed river valleys and used terrain masking to remain invisible to electronic surveillance, flying with the kind of precision that turned navigation into an art form. As the Apache crossed back into Afghan airspace, she monitored military frequencies for any mention of the SEAL extraction or her own unauthorized flight. The communications traffic remained routine, suggesting that the operation had been contained within special operations channels that didn't intersect with conventional military bureaucracy. With luck, she might be able to return the helicopter to its hangar before anyone noticed it had been missing. But luck, as any combat pilot knew, was a finite resource. Ghost Actual, this is Kandahar Control. You are flying an unauthorized aircraft in restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately and follow vectors to the nearest military facility for inspection. The voice carried the crisp authority of an air traffic controller who'd been trained to handle airspace violations, but Delaney detected something else underneath the official tone. Curiosity, perhaps, or professional respect for piloting skills that had just accomplished something supposedly impossible. Kandahar Control, Ghost Actual. Request permission to return to home station for aircraft maintenance and crew rest. The silence that followed lasted exactly 37 seconds, long enough for Delaney to imagine the conversations taking place in control towers and command centers, as various military officials tried to decide how to handle a situation that didn't appear in any manual. Ghost Actual, Kandahar Control. You are cleared direct to home station. Advise when aircraft is secured and crew available for debrief. The formal language couldn't quite conceal the underlying message. Land the helicopter, park it where it belongs, and prepare to explain everything to people who would decide whether she'd saved lives or committed career suicide. Delaney accepted the clearance with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the night, though her hands trembled slightly as she acknowledged the transmission. The abandoned hangar appeared through her aircraft's navigation system exactly as she'd left it hours earlier, though the world had changed fundamentally in the interim. She brought the Apache into a perfect landing, feeling the familiar sensation of rotor wash settling into stillness and turbine noise, fading into the ambient sounds of a military installation, waking up to another day of war. As she completed the shutdown checklist, Delaney realized that regardless of what happened next, she'd answered the only question that really mattered. When American soldiers had needed help, she'd found a way to provide it. The bureaucrats could debate regulations and international law, but 12 Navy SEALs were alive because she'd chosen to act rather than follow orders. She pulled the canvas shroud back over the Apache and walked toward whatever consequences awaited. Colonel Marcus Webb found her in the base's operations center 3 hours later, sitting in front of a computer terminal and methodically typing an after-action report that would either exonerate her or provide evidence for her court-martial. She'd changed from her flight suit into standard utility uniform, but her hair still carried the slight deformation that came from wearing a flight helmet for extended periods. "Captain Rourke." His voice carried the carefully neutral tone of a senior officer who hadn't yet decided whether he was addressing a hero or a criminal. "I believe we need to discuss your activities during the past 8 hours." Delaney saved her report and turned to face him with the kind of calm acceptance that came from making peace with consequences before actions. "Yes, sir. I assume you'd like to start with my unauthorized use of military equipment for an operation that officially never happened." Webb studied her for a long moment, noting the fatigue lines around her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands that suggested someone running on adrenaline and determination rather than sleep. He'd read her personnel file during the 3 hours since learning of her involvement in the SEAL extraction, and the picture that emerged was of an officer whose tactical brilliance was matched only by her complete inability to accept orders she considered morally wrong. "The SEALs you extracted have been transferred to Walter Reed Medical Center," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "Petty Officer Williams underwent 6 hours of surgery, but he's expected to make a full recovery. The Pakistani government has classified the entire incident as a medical emergency and requested that we not discuss it publicly." Delaney nodded, unsurprised by the diplomatic solution that allowed all parties to avoid uncomfortable questions about sovereignty and authorization. Military medicine had always operated in gray areas where saving lives took precedence over bureaucratic niceties. "Sir, I want to be clear about something. I acted without authorization, used military equipment without permission, and violated the direct orders that grounded me from flight status. I don't regret any of those decisions, but I accept full responsibility for them." Webb pulled out a folder containing documents that would determine her future in the military. The court-martial paperwork had already been prepared, requiring only his signature to set in motion a process that would likely end her career. But the folder also contained something else, a recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, supported by statements from 12 Navy SEALs who credited her with saving their lives. "Captain, the military has a complicated relationship with officers who refuse to follow orders, even when those orders are clearly wrong. We need discipline and chain of command to function, but we also need people who understand that regulations exist to serve larger purposes." He opened the folder and removed both sets of paperwork, placing them on the table where she could see the competing paths her future might take. "The question isn't whether you violated regulations. You clearly did. The question is whether those violations serve the interests of the United States military and the soldiers under our protection." Delaney looked at the court-martial documents, recognizing the end of everything she'd worked toward since joining the military. Then she looked at the medal recommendation, understanding that recognition for heroism often came with prices that weren't immediately apparent. "Sir, I joined the military to serve something larger than myself. If that service requires accepting court-martial for saving American lives, then I accept that consequence." Webb smiled for the first time since learning of the night's events. He'd hoped she would respond exactly as she had, with the kind of moral clarity that distinguished true leaders from bureaucrats in uniform. "Captain Rourke, effective immediately, you are reinstated to flight status with a recommendation for promotion to major. Your next assignment will be as commanding officer of our new Special Operations Aviation Unit, with primary responsibility for developing tactics and procedures for missions that don't officially exist." The silence that followed carried the weight of a career transformed and a future suddenly reimagined. 6 months later, Major Delaney Ghost Rourke stood before a hangar containing 6 modified Apache helicopters and a team of pilots she'd personally selected for their combination of technical skill and willingness to operate in the gray areas between official policy and practical necessity. The Special Operations Aviation Unit had been established with funding that appeared nowhere in public budgets, tasked with missions that would never appear in official records. Her pilots came from across the military aviation community. An Air Force A-10 pilot who'd been grounded for refusing to abandon Marines under fire, a Navy helicopter pilot whose rescue operations had saved over 200 personnel during 3 deployments, and 4 Apache pilots whose tactical innovations had pushed their aircraft beyond design specifications in service of keeping ground forces alive. "The missions we'll undertake don't exist," she told them during their first briefing. "The aircraft we fly aren't officially assigned to any unit. The people we rescue or support will never know our names, and the enemy we engage will never see us coming. We are ghosts, operating in the spaces between official policy and moral obligation." The unit's first operation came 3 weeks later. A CIA operative captured in Syria, held in a facility that official sources claimed was impregnable. The rescue required crossing international borders, avoiding surface-to-air missile batteries, and extracting a single person from a compound defended by over 50 enemy fighters. Delaney led the mission personally, demonstrating the tactics she developed during countless unauthorized flights into terrain that official doctrine declared impossible to penetrate. Her Apache danced between mountain peaks and slipped through radar coverage like something born from the sky itself, while her wingmen provided covering fire that allowed ground forces to complete their extraction without casualties. The operative they rescued carried intelligence that prevented 3 terrorist attacks and saved an estimated 400 civilian lives. The operation never appeared in any official records, and the pilots received no public recognition for their actions. But word spread through the special operations community about the Ghost unit that could accomplish missions other forces couldn't attempt. Each successful operation added to the legend, creating a reputation that drew the attention of commanders facing impossible tactical situations. When conventional forces couldn't reach isolated personnel, when official policy prohibited the kind of aggressive action required to save lives, when diplomatic considerations prevented acknowledging military operations in sensitive regions, they called for the ghosts. Delaney found purpose in the invisible war her unit fought, the one that existed in the margins between official conflicts and bureaucratic limitations. Her pilots developed into a cohesive team that could read each other's intentions without radio communication, operating with the kind of intuitive coordination that came from shared commitment to principles that transcended regulations. The criticism came from predictable sources: military officials who prioritized diplomatic considerations over operational effectiveness, politicians who preferred risk-averse policies that avoided potential embarrassment, and bureaucrats who measured success through compliance with procedures rather than accomplishment of missions. But the support came from sources that mattered more: special operations teams who'd been extracted from impossible situations, intelligence operatives who'd been rescued from capture and torture, and ground forces who'd received close air support when official channels had failed them. The Ghost unit operated in the shadows by design, their existence acknowledged only by the people whose lives they'd saved, and the enemies who'd learned to fear the sound of helicopters that appeared without warning and vanished without trace. They were the military's admission that sometimes the right thing to do existed outside the boundaries of acceptable policy, and that exceptional circumstances required exceptional responses. Delaney had found her place in that gray area between official doctrine and practical morality, leading pilots who shared her willingness to accept personal risk in service of larger principles. The congressional hearing room felt alien to someone who'd spent the past year operating in the shadows, but Major Delaney Rourke maintained the same calm professionalism she brought to combat operations, as she faced questions from legislators who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. The classified briefing had been requested by the House Intelligence Committee following reports of unauthorized military operations that had somehow prevented several high-profile terrorist attacks. Major Rourke, are you confirming that your unit has conducted operations without proper authorization from the Department of Defense? The question came from Congressman Bradley Morrison, whose political career had been built on criticizing military spending and advocating for diplomatic solutions to international conflicts. Congressman, I'm confirming that my unit operates under direct authorization from the National Command Authority for missions that require exceptional flexibility in rules of engagement and operational parameters. Delaney's answer had been carefully crafted to acknowledge reality while maintaining the legal fiction that protected both her pilots and the officials who'd quietly supported their operations. The truth was more complex than any congressional hearing could accommodate. The Ghost Unit existed in a bureaucratic limbo, funded through intelligence budgets that didn't require detailed oversight, and authorized through classified directives that provided broad operational latitude. They answered directly to a small group of senior officials who understood that certain missions required capabilities that couldn't be constrained by conventional military doctrine. Can you provide specific examples of these operations and their strategic value? This question came from Congresswoman Sarah Chen, whose military background had earned her a position on the Intelligence Committee and a reputation for asking questions that revealed uncomfortable truths. Delaney glanced at the classification officer, who nodded permission to discuss certain operations in general terms. Over the past year, our unit has conducted 17 operations that resulted in the rescue of 43 American personnel, the prevention of 6 planned terrorist attacks, and the recovery of intelligence that led to the disruption of 3 international arms trafficking networks. The numbers didn't capture the human cost. The nights spent flying through mountain passes that existed in the margins of official maps, the wounded pilots who'd pushed damaged aircraft beyond safe operational limits to complete extractions, the stress of operating in airspace where mistakes were measured in body bags rather than paperwork. But they also didn't capture the letters she'd received from families of rescued personnel, the quiet acknowledgments from intelligence officials whose operations had been saved by impossible extractions, or the respect of special operations teams who knew they could count on support when official channels failed them. Major, there are reports that your unit has violated international law, conducted unauthorized border crossings, and engaged in combat operations without proper legal authorization. How do you respond to these allegations? Morrison's tone suggested someone preparing for a political prosecution rather than seeking genuine understanding. Congressman, international law recognizes the principle of humanitarian intervention, and our operations have consistently focused on protecting American lives and preventing terrorist attacks against civilian populations. We operate within legal frameworks that acknowledge the complexity of modern warfare and the limitations of conventional diplomatic approaches. The hearing continued for 3 more hours, covering operational details that couldn't be fully discussed in any public forum and policy implications that would be debated in classified sessions. Delaney answered each question with the same professional competence she brought to flight operations, understanding that her unit's future depended on convincing politicians that some capabilities were worth the risks they entailed. When the session concluded, she was approached by Congresswoman Chen, whose questions had been the most penetrating but also the most informed. Major, off the record, how many American lives would have been lost if your unit hadn't existed? Delaney considered the question carefully, calculating casualties that hadn't occurred, because impossible missions had become routine operations. Ma'am, I can't provide precise numbers, but I can tell you that families who still have loved ones coming home for dinner might give you a different perspective on operational authorization and international law. Chen nodded, understanding that some truths couldn't be quantified in congressional testimony, but were nevertheless essential to national security. The Ghost Unit would continue operating in the shadows, their existence justified by results that couldn't be achieved through conventional means. The medal ceremony took place in a hangar at Dover Air Force Base, attended by a small group of officials whose presence wouldn't appear in any public records. Major Delaney Rourke stood at attention as Lieutenant General Patricia Hayes, the first female director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to her uniform, the military's second highest decoration for valor, recognizing actions that